Yeah, we're coming back to the topic that we just started a few seconds ago. How does the archive in progress affect art? So as we have an artist that's active in this field, can you tell us more about it? Yes.
I guess I sort of had some problems with, or at least questions rather than problems, with the idea of the terms of the question, in a sense, because the archive in progress, I mean, to me, it asks as many questions. I mean, it can mean so many things, and part of the idea of progress is also a problem. I mean, it's not necessarily progressive, this sense of, and I was thinking about what you were saying, you know, the question about whether we, and I know it's going to come up later, but I'll mention it now anyway, you know, whether we archive all of Twitter and Facebook and everything, and, you know, whether that becomes possible or is already possible or not, you know, that to me is not necessarily progressive, and maybe the idea of in progress towards something is not the point.
How, if we would restructure the question?
And also whether it's art. I don't think there is some kind of a monolith that is art. I think that the archive that you're doing shows that, in a sense, actually is kind of... There is an assumption that there is something called art, and therefore we're going to add what we think is art to that archive. But there's a lot of stuff that, you know, that could be... Well, I mean, we don't have to decide whether it's art or not, in a sense. It's there, so it is. Clearly, if something sort of falls through that net and doesn't appear at any point in an archive or, you know, the museum or the archive in the more, the widest possible sense, perhaps it then disappears. I mean, and it doesn't exist anymore. So, you know, if the archive... There is always that fear, sorry to jump around a bit, but if you work in digital media, you always kind of wake up, jumping up in the middle of the night and suddenly realizing, oh, shit, I don't know. Sorry, that's going to go down. Anyway, I've lost it. You know, I haven't preserved it. Oh no, what happens if that hard drive melts down and, you know, it doesn't work anymore? I'm never going to be able to retrieve it again. And I really liked that work. That was the one to keep, and I've lost it. So there is always, you know, that sense of, like, the digital archive anyway as something that is perpetually threatened with disappearance. I guess, yeah, I don't know if I've really answered the question, but...
Yeah, I mean, in terms of practice, I mean, I think what's really... I mean, I would argue that what's really emphasised the archive within, you know, contemporary art practice, filmmaking, and so on is the advent of photography, cinema, and then film, and now, you know, video, the streams of images, and the idea then montage becomes important because it's how you reorganise those and present them to make a story or something that's more complex than a story. How you change the whole meaning by reorganising those elements. And so it seems key to those kinds of practices that are being selective in that way. And also there's the whole thing about whether you generate the archive yourself or whether you're going to existing archives. I think that John O'Comfrey was in an interview recently that I was in, and John was actually saying about how, you know, I mean, I remember him being lambasted back in the 80s for, you know, he never shoots his own material. He's always using other people's archive material. And what he said was, well, I like the association that the image already has so that you can manipulate that meaning that's already been ascribed to it or and that gives you sort of added value in a way. You put another spin on that. And I think that's an amazing, empowering process to sort of think that you don't always have to generate everything that's new, that you're constantly redefining what's already out there in the world by reordering it. And giving it a new meaning.
I think giving new meaning is also like a very characteristic thing for post-digital art. And Attilia, you're our expert on working with artists who actually do that. So could you say something about maybe how the artists use archives to make new works from your experience?
Me?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
So I was reflecting on this, and clearly there are all sorts of different approaches, because clearly existing archives are already materials that artists can engage with in a sort of post-production level. So they use existing material and then they re-engage, reworking on it. The first example that came to my mind is a recent exhibition. We had a Pardes Gallery again, and artist represented artist called Orasats used a cinema archive, taking film shots from Joanne, the Woman, a film from 1916, and she reworked these images of the film, highlighting the fact that female were the one that were hand-painting the special effects into each of the photograms. And then she collaborated with a sound artist and created a special sound for it. So she went to the archive, she selected the exact photogram that she was interested on to convey her message. So it's kind of like leading on an institution that has been archiving for her, but then using the material, making it new. From a digital point of view, the situation is really vast because there's all sorts of people kind of like dealing with the idea of archiving from different points of view. So if we think that the website that I mentioned before could be considered archive of other people's work and the images of other people's work and recreating a different contraposition within these works is already a sort of new archiving of existing materials. Or one of the projects that I was highlighting before in the talk is a project from 2002 that is on Rhizome, and is this artist that sold all his life, all his belongings on eBay. So often what is based on digital practice is actually connected with distribution, which is something that digital artists and their way they store images and even like documentation images are always connected with where these images are going to go. And then this brings me to the second point of the question, and is like, is the archiving of the exhibition a fundamental part of artists I've been working with in making work? Yes, because the image for them often becomes the nature of the work and how it's going to be distributed. This image becomes often more important than the real experience. I constantly speak with artists that tell me they've seen an exhibition in New York, and I ask them if they took a flight, and they say, no, I saw it on the internet. And for me as a curator, it's like, yes, but an exhibition is different than the documentation of that exhibition. And I find that quite absurd that young generations think that they've seen the show and they capture it, the sense of the show just through documentation picture, but yes, it happens. So it's quite a peculiar turning point within what is the archival documentation of what has been displayed and what is the actual display, and now people engage with that on a sort of creative level, but as well educational level. So it's quite borderline within that.
So, thank you. Ezra, what do you think? Are we now seeing, like, we're going to see on Artstack, like, photos of exhibitions, and because of websites like, I don't know, Contemporary or Daily or Moose Magazine, we're only going to see shows online, and we're going to maybe, I don't know, stop going to them?
I guess there's kind of a few different components. One is definitely, so obviously, installation shots are prevalent on Artstack, and also artists using works that they've found on Artstack that they've been influenced by people or any other archive. Interestingly, actually, the Artstack logo is now being featured in certain artists' work themselves, which is kind of a curious sort of, circle. But I think kind of a few different things in answer to your question. Will people actually stop going to exhibitions? I think absolutely not. Actually, one of the interesting things. The Tate did some research a few years ago about putting an exhibition online and whether people who went to that exhibition then would feel as though if they'd seen it online, they shouldn't have gone to the exhibition, or vice versa. And interestingly, I think about 60% of the people who saw the exhibition online said they would be much more likely to see an exhibition in the next year. And only 3% of the people who went to the show, when asked if you could have stayed at home in your pajamas, would you have opted for that? They said yes. So what that really says is seeing work online is no replacement for seeing work in person. In fact, if anything, it's most likely to increase audiences as opposed to replace them. And certainly what we do on the website, and you saw a little bit of one of the new features that we're adding shortly, is actually in particular to show where work is in fact coming up that you will be able to see in person. So we're actually trying to help drive audiences to have a real world experience based on something that they've seen on the internet. So, you know, that 97% of people who go to exhibitions and actually don't want to stay in their pajamas, I think will in fact, the overall number is going to grow. In fact, I think there's a couple interesting things about the notion of the archive, and this probably, I'll split this into some, there's another question that kind of talks about this in a little while, so I'll keep this brief. But there's an interesting notion about, first of all, access to material, which artists now have more easily than they've ever had before. So, you know, in some ways, like what you're doing here at St. Martin's, actually, an artist doesn't even need to be at St. Martin's anymore to have access to amazing content that previously they would never have. You know, you could be sitting in you know, your parents' place in Scotland, and still, if you've got an internet connection, have access to incredible information that maybe will influence your practice. On the other hand, what does change, however, and this is something that's come up literally, I think, only once since we started ArtStack about 2 years ago, an artist who's quite successful, and this is really just one time, but I think it's an interesting thing, asked that some of his own works be removed from the site. And the reason he wanted that, although they were very popular on the site, was because he felt that his own practice had changed quite a lot. And I really thought they were great works. A lot of other people thought they were great works. But he didn't want to feel as though his online footprint, his representation as an artist, included this work that he didn't feel reflected where he was today. And this is where the living archive, the archive that's in progress, actually takes on a kind of new twist. And I think it's something that people haven't really thought about in detail, even as regards, let's say, other social media like Facebook or Twitter, the fact that you are no longer able to rewrite your own history the way that you maybe would have been able to 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, you could have been, you know, a punk kid with no friends who was 17 and wore, you know, whatever, black all over. And today, you're, you know, a jolly outgoing individual who's extremely social. You wouldn't today necessarily be able to erase that history. And so the notion of being able to rewrite your own history and change, whether in art or elsewhere, is becoming increasingly difficult. And actually, if you think about it, is that a good thing? And do we need, you know, maybe turning into the next question, but do we really need to document all these things? What's so bad about forgetting sometimes? Are all of these images, you know, even your image of these poor people who were killed in Soviet Russia, I don't mean to sound like an asshole, but it's very, very sad. But not every story is a great story, and not every version of that story is a great story. And sometimes we don't need to remember everything, actually. Sometimes in our own histories, that's a good thing. And the existence of an online system, I mean, I say this owning one, you know, having set it up, but, you know, people don't think about space in the same way anymore. So where previously you would reach a point where you ran out of room and therefore you throw some stuff out, now you have a system where all of your images are on your computer Google gives you a certain amount of space. We certainly don't have any limits on that. The only cost is, frankly, to me, in terms of our hosting costs. But beyond that, you have the feeling that you should be able to keep every film you've ever made, every image you've ever had. Digital photography means that you can take 1 billion photos. None of them even has to be any good. And as long as you don't run out of room on your hard drive, you're kind of good to go. Whereas previously, you would have had to buy the film, produce the film, print it, choose which images you wanted to print. This all has a cost. It all takes time. And actually, if you think about it, a lot of those shots that were taken weren't any good. So why do we want to keep them? Why do we want to archive them, actually? I think there is a question which eventually we're going to have to face, which is sometimes our lives are frankly not that interesting.
Thank you. Judy, would you like to add something?
Well, I mean, I think I'd almost rather skip answering question 2 because we're already moving into question 3 and this question of the digital and how we archive in a digital world. And I think it would probably be more interesting for me to respond to that.
Okay,
so
let's jump to the next question. Oh, sorry.
Would it be able to respond briefly to that? I mean, would it be all right to briefly respond to that question? I mean, to respond to what you said, because discussion as well. Because I was thinking about, we don't have a shortage of space, but we do have an increasingly shorter attention span and time because of the amount of time. I mean, this is a truism, obviously, but it's about changing the audience. I mean, that the audience is, obviously become more and more niche, in a sense. But this, rather than running out of space, we're running out of time. We're running out of attention. There is that idea of no longer having any sleep. I forget who writes about that now. The sort of destruction of sleep, that we're just constantly awake and online and having to. It's not Douglas Coupland, but he could have said it. Anyway, so that thing is, and what you're saying about whether well, not everything has to be archived, but it is. That's the thing. Is that not everything is archived, but what is interesting is the edit, and in fact that is everything, and in fact that's the main question for everybody. Even if it's about in your life, it's about editing and about choosing the images. I mean, as you said, James, about having to make sense of all the footage, everything, all the photographs that you've ever taken. But you do, at some level, one does. At that particular moment, one edits. Anyway, so I feel that that's the biggest, the biggest question of the effect of the digital on art, perhaps, is the question of the edit.
Thank you.